Yeah, I'm recording it. So recording is in progress at this point. Welcome to the fourth myth session on mythology, which I'm delighted to be able to give. And tonight we're going to start with the flower myths and to talk about some things around the flower myths and associated with flower myths. And then I thought we'd try to dive into the Perseus myth and see how far we can get through that. So um, I wanted to briefly explain three flower myths. And then after we explain the flower myths, I want to talk about some history around it and also some symbolism that's associated with it. So the first one I want to start with is the flower myth of Narcissus. And my wife gets frustrated sometimes with me because she has lots and lots of flowers here. And anytime she mentions one of the flowers that's named after somebody in mythology, I immediately go into my spiel on that individual, and she kind of grimaces and puts up with it. At any rate, Narcissus. Um, in this myth, Narcissus is an extremely handsome young man, and he won't have anything to do with women. And and I'm going to simplify these myths, by the way, so I can get through a little more quickly. But so he shuns the women, even though he's extremely handsome and they're all drawn to him. One particular nymph who is especially drawn to him is named Echo. And she's one of these individuals that we all know somebody like this. She can talk 90 miles an hour, not really say too much of anything. She's always very happy and just glad to be alive, so glad to see you, and et cetera, et cetera. And anytime that Hera is looking for Zeus, suspicioning that he's philandering again, Echo is right there just chattering away, and Hera eventually gets so frustrated with her that she turns on Echo and vents her wrath by cursing Echo to speak only the last words spoken to her, but never to speak her own words. And so Echo has a problem now because she can't continue to express her love for Narcissus. And Narcissus is a young man who, as many of the people in Greek mythology and men in Greek mythology, they're hunters, and he likes to go hunting, and he has hunting buddies, and he's out right now looking for his buddies, and he comes into a clearing and calls out, "Is anybody here?" And Echo, who's stalking him, basically, she's a stalker, and she sees her opportunity, so she launches out from behind a tree and yells, "Here, here!" It comes launching toward him like one of those slow motion butter commercials. Um, and basically, he says, "Back." And so she decides that she's lost her last chance to win Narcissus over. And so she goes into a cave and she stays there and waits away until the only thing left for of her is her voice, which still haunts caves and valleys, etc. today. Now, Narcissus was not being responsive to love from others, and so Aphrodite, who's in charge of all forms of love, including romantic love, decided, okay, if you can't love someone else, then you can love yourself. And she arranged it so that when he was walking by a pond one day, a very clear pond, he looked down into the water and for the first time saw his own reflection. And he fell in love immediately with that reflection. And he sat down by the pond and he tried to kiss the figure. And every time his lips touched the water, the figure would go away. And he would wait there and it would come back. And he apparently was not the brightest crayon in the box because he continued doing this for through into the night. Now, when the next morning came, where he was sitting, there was a new flower called the narcissus, which bends its head forward to look at its reflection in the water. Now, There's another part, another version of this myth, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But there's another version in this myth that says that he was kissing that water and that there was a water nymph in that pond. And when she saw him kissing the water several times, that she came up and wrapped her arms around him and pulled him into the pond and to live with her, which meant his doom. That's just a variant of the myth. And what I want to mention about that is one thing we have to remember as we're dealing with mythology is that almost every myth has many variations of the myth. And that comes from the fact that it's an oral tradition for over 1,000 years. And it's a little bit like the telephone game, where if you sit in a circle and you have a little paragraph that you recite to somebody and then whisper to somebody and then they whisper to the next person, et cetera, et cetera. By the time it comes around, it's completely changed. Well, just imagine the telephone game over 1,000 year period. And it's not surprising that there are so many variations of the myth, of each of these myths, but that there aren't more than that. The other thing we have to remember is this: all of the mythology that we know is only that which was recorded once they moved from the oral tradition to the written tradition. And so there was an awful lot of the mythology which simply ceased to exist after the oral tradition was no longer cared for. And so what we have, fortunately, are the remnants or the pieces that were recorded by the bards. And the bards, for the most part, many of them anyway, were blind. It was one way they could make their living as a professional bard. And so they didn't actually write it down, but they had scribes who recorded the information. And it's interesting to note that, and this is old information. I can't really tell you how long ago this is true, but there was an oral tradition in Scotland, and it went for a long time, and there was finally there was one Gaelic bard left, and he was recorded doing his oral tradition for a few years by researchers. And then when he passed on without an apprentice, the oral tradition of the Gaelic legends, etc., died with him, except that they had recorded all of this information, so it moved forward. So that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about in dealing with each of these myths, is that we have different variations of the myth, and it was partly the telephone game thing, but also partly political aspects, meaning that it was told differently in different places according to the politics of those places. And so the bards would make extra money by working in local heroes and local leaders, et cetera, into the stories. And so depending on where the story was told and where the record was made of that story is the variations that you'll see in these different myths. So that was Narcissus and Echo. The next one is Hyacinthus. And Hyacinthus was a handsome young man who was befriended by Apollo, the god Apollo. And it is very common in Greek mythology that the immortals will have favorite mortals. And those immortals will often take on mortal form, meaning that they're not their giant selves or in magnificent. Zeus, for instance, transforms himself into many things, animals and what have you, but he also has a masked human form that he uses with his seductions of different women. And one of them wanted to see him in his full glory, and he warned her that that would kill her, but she insisted. And so he had promised her that he would do something if she asked for it. And so he did reveal himself, and it did, in fact, kill her. She was pregnant with a child, a god, actually, a god. And so he did a cesarean section and took that god out and sewed him into Zeus's thigh, where that god finished growing up and came out later. So this idea, though, that the gods took on human form is was common in mythology. Well, Apollo was very much a friend of Hyacinthus, and they would get together and they would compete in athletic skills. And of course, Apollo, if he used his full strength, etc., would be unbeatable, but he would mask his ability in contesting with Hyacinthus. And one day they were throwing the discus from one end of the field to the other, each of them at the other end of the field. And Apollo threw the discus, and in some versions of the myth, it just accidentally gets blown off course. In other versions of the myth, one of the wind gods is jealous of the relationship between Apollo and Hyacinthus and intentionally blows the discus off course. Either way, the discus strikes Hyacinthus in the forehead, and he's bleeding out. Apollo goes and holds him in his arms as he dies, and then where his blood hits the ground, and this is extremely important for understanding historically and symbolically what these myths are about. And where his blood hit the ground, he caused the new flower to grow up, the hyacinth. Okay, now I'm going to come back to that after I do the next one as well. And that next one is Adonis. And Adonis, and again, is a handsome young man. Actually, he's a baby. When he's born, Aphrodite sees him and she sees what he will be, a very handsome young man. And so she steals him from the cradle and takes him down to the underworld and gives him into the care of Persephone, the queen of the dead, and tells Persephone, raise this young man up and I will come back for him when he's grown. Well, as you might suspect, he becomes a very handsome young man, and Persephone has fallen in love with him, which is a little dangerous when her husband is Hades, but that doesn't play a role in this particular myth. So she has fallen in love with him, and when Aphrodite comes to claim him, she says, no, he's going to stay with me. And they two goddesses get into a quarrel, and Zeus becomes an arbitrator, and he says, okay, here's the deal. Narcissus will spend half the year in the underworld with Persephone and half the year becomes a hunter. And he's hunting with dogs, which is common with the ancient Greeks. And he manages to corner a boar. The dogs have cornered this boar, and Adonis throws his spear at the boar and wounds it, but does not kill it. And the boar, enraged by the dogs and the wound, charges Adonis and gores him, and he is mortally wounded and falls to the ground as he calls out Aphrodite, who's flying overhead. She's used sometimes with him in the forest, but this time she was not. She's flying overhead in her swan cart, which is a chariot drawn by swans. And that's her mode of transportation. And she comes zipping to him. And again, she holds him in her arms as he returns to Persephone forever. And so she causes a new flower to go. This one's not called the Adonis. It's called the blood red anemone. And that is the flower of the blood of Adonis. Now, the significance of these flower myths, and there's many, many more flower myths, and there's tree myths, and there's things behind them. But these particular three myths reveal a dark time of ancient Greece, in that they are reflective of human sacrifice. The early individuals in the Greek area associated life with the blood in their veins, and that the food of the land fed. Hold on here. Get my grandson's just popping in. So he's joining. Just a minute, and I'll finish making this statement here in a minute. Hello, Chance. Are you there? You're
Yeah.
muted. Oh, there we go. Hi, Chance.
Hi.
Hey, we're partway into the thing, and I'm just about to wrap up a little with this of a statement on the flower myths before I get into the Perseus myth. And what I've talked about is the fact that there's three different flower myths that wherein a flower grows from the death of an individual, and so those are Narcissus, Hyacinthus, and Adonis. Um, Narcissus, of course, is the narcissus flower. Hyacinthus is the hyacinth, but Adonis is the blood red anemone. So, what I was saying, and we're recording this, you can catch the first part if you want later. What I was saying is that these three myths reflect a dark time of ancient Greece, and it is a time when human sacrifice was practiced. They felt that the blood of their bodies that gave them life came from the food of the land. And when there was a famine, when there's a drought or the crops didn't grow properly, they resorted to giving the blood back to the land with a human sacrifice, and with the hopes that that would bring the crops back to being. Um, as the Greeks became more sophisticated, more um, less tolerant of that kind of activity, they changed the myths to what we see today, which is a romantic version of the loss of these individuals. But it really is reflective of a much darker practice from early on. The later Greeks abhorred the thought of human sacrifice, even though some of their myths did include it, such as the myth of the legend of Troy, when Iphigenia is sacrificed so that the Greeks can sail against Troy. So that the myths still did have an element of that in there, but these flower myths reflect that very greatly in the telling of those myths. So before I launch into Perseus, are there any questions or comments about the flower myths? Okay.
This isn't the same thing as if I'm out in my garden and I stick my finger with a thorn or something and I bleed. It's not the same, right?
Well, no, I mean, um, the Greeks called blood mamma, which is where we get mammal.
Oh,
And so blood was the life part. The interesting thing is that the what gave the gods immortality was that they didn't have blood in their veins. They had ichor. Ichor, R spelling, Ikor, or some deviant of that for the Greek spelling. But ichor was what ran in their veins, and the nourishment of that was two things: ambrosia, which is the food of the gods, and nectar, which is the drink of the gods. And so their ichor was nourished by nectar and uh, ambrosia. So they did recognize the contents of the veins as being fundamental to life. All right, cool. Let's launch into Perseus. And this one begins with a prophecy. King of Argos, Acrisius, um, is given a prophecy that concerns him greatly. He goes to an oracle, and asks, what his future holds for him, etc. And and he's the king of Argos, and he is told that he will lose his throne to a grandson, and that the grandson will kill him. And so Acrisius decides, since he has only a daughter, Danae, and she's young and innocent, that he will avoid this prophecy by imprisoning her so that she cannot be impregnated. And the thing about the mythology is that when an oracle is true, and a prophet, if the prophet gives false prophecy, then they can be put to death. So they became very good at ambiguity in order to stay alive. But if they get an oracle, then it's the one thing you can always count on is it's going to come to pass. It's absolutely going to come to pass. The Greeks, the characters in the stories kind of know that, but they still hope springs eternal in the human breast, and they go about trying to make it not happen. And very often, the very act, excuse me, the very act of trying to make it not happen causes it to happen. That's not particularly the case in this one. In this one, King Chrysius has a brass apartment made, um, and then it's you know living quarters, and it's buried in the ground with his daughter in it. And there's only a small opening in the top, big enough to get water and food and air to her. So she's no longer available. And Chrysius thinks, okay, I've got it taken care of. But Chrysius always underestimates things. And Zeus sees Danae as a beautiful young woman. Zing, he gets shot through the heart by Hermes, and he has to go be with Danae. And so he turns himself into a shower of gold and pours himself into the apartment. And he impregnates Danae. And then, as per his usual activity, he leaves. Now, she has a baby and she names it Perseus. And she manages to keep the child quiet for quite a while. But eventually, a guard who's delivering food and water hears the baby crying and goes and tells Acrisius, I think there's a baby down there. And Acrisius says, okay, it can't be. So they dig up the apartment, bring it up, and sure enough, there's Danae and her son, Perseus, the child that the oracle has declared would probably be his death and the loss of his kingdom. Now, here's the problem. The mortals understand that blood murder is dealt with by the Erinyes. And these are the sisters, usually three, who get revenge for blood murder. Now, the reason that they exist is in the early stages of ancient Greece, justice was accomplished by revenge. So if somebody killed somebody in your family, you didn't kill them. You killed somebody in their family because the loss of a loved one is worse than losing your own life. And so the problem with that justice by revenge is what do you do when somebody kills somebody in their own family? Kill another innocent member of your own family? No. The Erinyes will come, and the Erinyes will drive the individual insane and cause them to take their own life. So um, the king realizes this, and he decides that he cannot risk killing his grandson and his daughter, but he can put them in harm's way. And so he has them put into a chest and locked into a chest that has some holes drilled in it. And then he has his warriors throw the chest into the sea. Well, he's expecting it to fill up with water and they will drown, and that'll take care of that. But once again, he underestimates the gods, and Poseidon is not having any of this for blame or taking any of the blame for the death of a Perseus and a Danae. So he causes the chest to go ahead and float, and it floats to the island of Seriphos, and it washes up on the shore of Seriphos. And there is a fisherman named Dictys, and Dictys finds this chest and he breaks the lock and gets and opens it and finds this young woman and her babies or young son. And he takes them home to his wife and says, look, Annie, what I found on the beach, can we keep them? And so they become they become the child and grandchild of Dictys and his wife. And let's see here. Oh, by the way, the wife's name is Clymene. And so, and I've got some notes here so I don't miss anything. Um, so Perseus then is raised in this Dictys house, and Dictys is a fisherman, a very poor man, and so he has very little other than just the subsistence that they have there. And what's interesting though is his brother Polydectes is the king of the island and very wealthy, which tells us automatically about the character Polydectes. He lets his own brother live in poverty. And so he's obviously a bad guy. And so Dictys uh, raises, and Dictys and Clymene raise basically Danae and Perseus, and Perseus grows up to be a young man. Well, Polydectes sees Danae and decides, oh, wow, she's beautiful. I think I will marry her. But he doesn't want Perseus around. He wants to generate his own child and who will be the heir to the kingdom, etc. So he decides he has to get rid of Perseus somehow. And he comes up with a rather devious plan. He invites Perseus to the palace, and he's having a conversation with Perseus. Um, and he mentions to Perseus that he's very wealthy and he can have anything that he wants, except the one thing that he wants most he cannot buy, which is the head of a gorgon. Well, Perseus doesn't bother asking, why do you want the head of a gorgon? but and wonders why he's been told this. Perseus goes away, and then the king announces a great feast, and he invites all of his rich friends, and he invites Perseus to this feast. So when they come to the feast, Polydectes announces that he's getting married. He doesn't mention who he's getting married to, but he says he's getting married. And all of his rich friends start giving him great gifts. And Perseus, who's raised in a poor fisherman's house, has nothing to give. And so he remembers the conversation with Polydectes and says, oh, I will give the best gift of all. I will give the head of a gorgon. Now, the problem with that is gorgons um, are kind of dangerous. If you look at them, you get turned to stone. And so and the way they came into being was that they were beautiful, three beautiful sisters. And Poseidon seduced Medusa in the temple of Athena. And Athena, infuriated with that, because she's one of the virgin goddesses, changed the three sisters into the Gorgons. And these are horrible creatures, usually represented as a serpent from the waist down. They may have wings, like eagle's wings. They have gray scales. They have living snakes as hair. So they're pretty awful. And and so he's supposed to go get one of those heads. Well, there's only two of them. I'm sorry, two of them are immortal, and only one of them, Medusa, is mortal. And we can talk about mortals and immortal siblings in some later myths where I'll explain to you the biological explanation for some of these things. So Perseus claims that he's going to give the best gift of all, the head of a gorgon. And he knows that if he goes back home and tells Danae that he's going to go get a gorgon, she will not let him go. So he leaves immediately from the feast and goes and gets passage on a ship. And he doesn't know he's on the island of Seriphos. He doesn't know what to do. He's made this claim. He has no idea where the Gorgons are or how to deal with them or anything else. So he decides to go to the Oracle of Delphi. Now, the Oracle of Delphi, and he does, he goes to the Oracle of Delphi. Now, we're going to stop a pause here for a minute because we need to talk about that. The Oracle of Delphi is the oracle sacred to Apollo. Apollo is the god of truth, and the Oracle at Delphi was considered the best oracle for getting real answers, and they're honest answers. And so he goes there and he he asks, what do I do about this Gorgon thing? I need to, get the head of a Gorgon. And Apollo, now you have to understand the relationship here. Perseus is the son of Danae by Zeus. Apollo is the son of Zeus by another goddess. And so he's going to see his half brother. And he goes to his half brother, not maybe even realizing that. And he asks about, what do I do? And the only answer he gets at the oracle is to go to the land of Dodona. Well, the land of Dodona is an oracle. The oracle of Dodona is the oracle of Zeus. And so basically Apollo's saying, go ask dad. And so Perseus travels north um, to Dodona. And when he gets there, let's see here. I want to make sure I get this in the right order. Dodona. He's only told one thing at Dodona, and that is that the oracle there says that you're under the protection of the gods. So he knows he's got things going for him. And then he leaves there, and as he's leaving, um, he meets a stranger who has winged sandals, a winged staff, and a winged cap. And this is Hermes. So the sandals are the talaria, the staff is the petasis is the helmet, and I'll think of the staff here in a minute. At any rate, so he knows that it's Hermes.
Did he
And
say?
Hermes, then, remember, is a son of Zeus by another goddess. And so he's another half brother. And so Hermes is also the protector of travelers. So Perseus has been told he's under the protection of the gods, and now he has as a traveling mate the god of travelers who's giving him protection. And he also meets one other individual there, and that is Athena. And that Athena, again, is the daughter of Zeus. She's born from his head, from Zeus's head. So this is his half sister. So he's got a whole family thing going here. And he then goes from Dodona to the nymphs of the north, and that the Hyperboreans. And Hermes is able to um, tell him that that's where he needs to go. But the problem is he has to find out how to get to the Hyperboreans, those who live behind the wet north wind. And so Hermes guides him to the underworld, to the river Styx. And there's an island in the Styx where there's three witches, and these are the Gray Sisters or Gray Women or the Gree. And these sisters are interesting in their depiction. They're shown usually with swans' bodies, but gray. They have human heads, etc., and they have wings, but they have arms that come out from under the wings. And they have a strange anatomy. They have one eye that they can share among the three of them, and one tooth. In some of the myths, there's one tooth. I don't understand, I've never have understood the significance of one tooth. But the one eye has to do with the fact that these three goddesses, or the three Stygian witches, could see prophecy. But the way they did it was with the eye. Well, the eye was a crystal ball. And so they could hold the eye to their forehead and they could not only see the present, but they could see the future. Hermes explains to Perseus that he has to wait till they're passing the eye from one to the other and run in and steal the eye, and then use that to ransom the information on how to get to the Hyperboreans. Perseus does as he's told. He runs in, grabs the eye, and negotiates the return of the eye in exchange for information how to get to the Hyperboreans. And so he returns the eye and leaves to go to the Hyperboreans. When he gets to the Hyperboreans, to the nymphs behind the north wind, they give him some gifts, and he gets winged sandals, like Hermes' winged sandals, which gives Perseus the ability to fly. He also is given a magic wallet that will expand to hold whatever's put in it. And he's given the helmet of invisibility. Now, that is not particularly identified in the myth as being the helmet of Ares. I'm sorry, of Hades. There we go. having a senior moment. Hades, the word Hades means invisibility. And so when you bury someone in the underworld, they're no longer visible to you. One of his items that belongs to him is the helmet of invisibility, which renders its wearer invisible. Now, whether that is the helmet that he's given or whether this is another helmet of invisibility is not clear. But he's given this helmet which can make him invisible. So he has the sandals that allow him to fly. He has a magic wallet that'll hold whatever's placed in it. He has the well, okay, I need to explain one other thing too. The helm of invisibility, but he also has Hermes gives him a sword, which is a magic sword that will cut through this Gorgon's scales. And Athena gives him a shiny buckler. Now, the buckler she gives is the Aegis. The Aegis is the breastplate of Zeus. A buckler, a breastplate or shield can be two things. It can be a shield that's worn on the arm. It's usually round, or it can be a tall shield. But it also can be a buckler, which is basically a breastplate that's worn. In this particular case, the shield is it's a shield, and it's highly polished on the inside, so it's like a mirror. And he's told that he cannot look at the Gorgons without being turned to stone, but their reflection cannot hurt him. So he's to use the mirror to be able to see to get the head of Medusa. And so he's pretty well armed at this point. All the stuff that he's got, all the hit points. If this is a video game, he's ready for the big game. And with that, then he goes to where the uh, Medusa and the other um, Gorgons are. When they get there, he puts on the helmet. He's got the sandals on. He's flying. He's got the sword in his hand. He's invisible. And Athena actually draws like a dotted line on Medusa's neck. The three Gorgons are sleeping at this point. And basically, she puts a line on here and says, cut here. And so he raises the sword and he comes down and he slices off Medusa's head and he grabs it real quick and puts it into the wallet, which expands to hold it. So he's safe from it at that point. The other two sisters, oh, by the way, when he cuts off the head, two flying horses come out of the neck of Medusa, Pegasus and Chrysaor. And so that's the birth of those two flying horses. So he's invisible, he's flying around, he's got the wallet. The two sisters wake up and they're thrashing around trying to catch an invisible guy, and of course he gets away cleanly. And then he's flying away and he flies over Ethiopia. And as he's flying over Ethiopia, he sees this beautiful woman, Andromeda, is chained to the rocks on the beach, and that she's been placed there as a sacrifice to a horrible sea monster that's going to come and consume her. And the reason that she's changed to the rocks, and I always thought there should be a drink called Andromeda on the rocks. But the reason she's chained to the rock is that her mother, Cassiopeia, committed the sin of hubris. The sin of hubris is pride. And so she committed that sin by claiming that in some versions, that she was more beautiful than the goddesses, the Nereids, the daughters of the sea. In some other versions, that she and her daughter Andromeda are more beautiful than the Nereids. Either way, Poseidon requires that Andromeda be sacrificed to make up for Cassiopeia's sin. Well, Perseus decides this isn't going to work for him, so he pops down there and he's got the magic sword. And when the creature shows up, he kills this kills the creature, and then as a reward, he's given Andromeda as a bride. And before they leave, he actually has a child with Andromeda that they leave there with the father. And that plays a role in some mythology that we'll talk about later. But then he takes Andromeda and see here. He kills the monster, marries Andromeda. Okay, so now they've returned to Seriphos, to the island of Seriphos, where Perseus wants to make amends with his grandfather, but when he gets there, he finds out that the grandfather's not there, that in fact he's been tricked, and that Polydectes, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit off base here. Hold on a minute. Yeah. So um, you have to remember that Danae and Perseus were born, or Perseus was born in Argos. So they've come back to Seriphos, and then I got things a little out of kilter here. They find out, or Perseus realizes now that that Dictys and his mother are hiding somewhere on the island, and the reason they're hiding is that Polydectes announced that he's going to marry Danae, and suddenly Perseus realized he was tricked, that he was sent on a suicide mission, and so he goes to a feast that's being held by Polydectes with all those friends that helped set him up, and he comes into this hall, and they all look at him and are, "Oh man, you're here!" And he pulls the head of Medusa out of the wallet and holds it up, careful not to look at it himself. And all of Polydectes and all his friends are turned to stone. He then dispatches the head. Some cases he throws it into the sea. In some cases he puts it back in the wallet. But the bottom line is he's done away with Polydectes, and he places Dictys, the poor fisherman, on the throne as the king. Dictys' wife, by the way, during the time that Perseus was gone, Dictys' wife died, Clymene. She died. And so Dictys is placed on the throne, and Perseus takes Andromeda, and they return then to Argos. When they get there, they find out that his grandfather, who was the one that put them in the chest and had them thrown into the sea, etc., has been kicked out of the kingdom because he was not a good king. And so he's gone, he's out. And so Perseus is able to take the throne readily because he's the rightful heir to the throne. And as such, has a requirement to attend certain festivals, etc. And there is in the neighboring village in Larissa, King Tutamides is holding a funeral games. Now, funeral games are like kind of like the Olympics, and the individuals who come compete for prizes, etc., in honor of the individual who's for whom the funeral games are being held. So Perseus goes to Larissa to participate in the games, and is he is given the game of throwing the discus. And so he throws the discus, and this is where it gets interesting. The discus is blown off course and into the crowd of spectators, where it strikes Acrisius, who happens to be sitting in the crowd, strikes Acrisius and kills him, completing the prophecy. The prophecy never said anything about the death being intentional. And so Acrisius really caused this to happen to himself. With that, then Perseus goes on and Andromeda, and they have children, and they live happily ever after, basically. And so, several generations down from that, we get another bunch of Bronze Age heroes, etc. So, the Perseus myth it deals with deception. It deals with the prophecy and what prophecy is meant to be, etc. Um, so, there's a lot of things that we get out of the Perseus myth. It's a pretty complex myth, um, but it's one that gives us a good look at how the early myths, which were there only to explain natural phenomenon originally, hurricanes, lightning, etc., how they evolved into a literary form. And so this Perseus myth is a good example of moving into away from just explaining natural phenomenon and dealing with the character of personality and what have you among mortals. And that becomes a theme that is reflected in all of Greek mythology. So that's kind of it for the night tonight. And I'm hoping that if you have any questions or anything else that I can explain, um, this is the time.
Well, I was just going to say that it sounds like the moral of the story is be careful where you sit because you never know when you might be hit by a discus.
That's right. And always pay attention. Keep your eye on the discus. Be ready to duck.
Yeah, that was great. You know what I love about this? It's like I'm sitting back listening and you're just telling me a story. You know, and it's been years since anybody read a story to me. It's cool.
That's what I got from my students an awful lot. They told me that the reason they loved the Greek mythology class is that it was largely a storytelling. And I love doing that. I'm a little out of, as you saw tonight, I'm a little out of practice. I had to actually go back and do some reviews, but it's been 14 years since I actually did this. But um, it comes back as you deal with it. And
Great.
I've been with my writing that I've been doing, I've been dealing with more obscure elements of mythology and stuff, so not so much with the basic. So it's kind of fun to actually get back into the basic mythology and take a look at all of that. So that, as you can see in what we did with the flower myths and with Perseus, we're seeing a lot of symbolism and a lot of also one other comment that I wanted to make is that what you see in these myths and different things is resurrection, birth, death, and resurrection. And that is a theme that is in much of mythology, birth, death, and resurrection.
Also, the what's the connection, if there's any, with Odysseus?
Odysseus is much, much later. He's in the Trojan War, and he commits the sin of hubris, and it costs him very dearly, and it costs all of his men very dearly. They all lose their lives. Um, and so there's a great deal about him, but he is humbled by the experience. And we'll be dealing with the Odysseus myth, the Trojan War, and the Odyssey. Um, that one is extremely rich. The whole Troy legend and all of the things before and after it are very rich with literary, but also with um, psychological and philosophical elements that are
The
extremely important.
idea of the journey of of course he's trying to get home in
Yes.
his and in this one, but that it seems to be a theme they like to use then of setting their stories with these long journeys that would take you from setting to setting to setting.
Yes, and that is prevalent in that, especially the best example of that is the Jason and the Argonauts story, which we'll be dealing with, which is
Okay.
all really about. I always told my students that the um, the proper statement for the Jason and the Argonaut story is to boldly go where no man has gone before. That's exactly what it's about. Because
Wow.
to the ends of the earth, to where no Greek has ever been before. Because this Jason myth is actually previous to the Perseus myth.
Oh, okay.
So
Early Star
that's
Trek.
that they do, yes, and that was my point. And they very much worked travel and journeys, the journey, and it wasn't just the physical journey; it was the psychological, the philosophical, the growth journey, and that's what my books are about, largely, with Sinan and with Mentu. Both of those are very much, and Anisi and Strymon, for that matter, are all about the journey. And it's not the journey itself; it's what they gain from the journey. It's the personal growth, it's the awareness, etc. And so the mythology of ancient Greece is very reflective of that. Much of it is very reflective of that journey, which is manifest in the mythology.
Uh-huh. Oh, that's great.
So, is there any other questions or comments or anything? How's it going, Chance?
It's going fine.
Good. You killing it on your classes?
Yeah, mostly.
Oh, good. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, but I'll still be here. So just a minute. Stop. I'll stop.